So the Trump administration has fired the first shots in a war that will lead to, I believe, the rollback of many of our fuel economy standards, possibly emission standards, and reining in the power of California to set their own standards. This is not everything that people had hoped for, but I believe it's the first major step forward. So welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I am John, and there's a lot to unpack here. We're going to talk about where this all kind of came from, what actually was said by who, and what actually I find the most interesting about the fact that this is all started. So back before Trump's first term, there were going to be increasing fuel economy and emissions standards. When Trump took office, he actually fought against those, and they ended up lowering the standards. It's important to note you can't just by executive order write those away. It has to go through a process, which took about 2 years. The law actually directs the agency to set the maximum feasible fuel economy standards. We're going to focus on fuel economy, okay? So it's not purely regulators running away. It is, Congress has said you have to set the maximum that is what can feasibly be achieved by the industry. But when you have a gigantic bureaucracy, if you've ever worked in a corporate environment, you know, figures don't lie, but liars figure. And so what happened is that when Biden came into power, he signed a new 87 Federal Register 14570 or something like that. Had a bunch of updates for the Coast Guard and everybody else, but that included the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, which administers the CAFE standards. CAFE is Corporate Average Fuel Economy, which sets the fuel economy standards that cars, at least the fleet of them that a manufacturer sells, has to meet. And originally, those were going to be 2% a year for both cars and light trucks. They reduced it down. They changed it for the trucks, giving a couple of years of no changes, and then decreased it. But the end result was a 1.5% increase every year. And between, I believe it was 2024 and 2029, I'll verify that and put it up on the screen, basically car fuel economy had to go up by nearly 20% in about 5 years. Now, I want you to think about the fuel economy of a 70s car, and it took us 40 years to get to this point, and then they want to squeeze in a 20% increase. And that's part of the hang-up. Now, I'm not going to dig into the facts on the emission standards as well, but they play into here. And what you've got is a mandate for EVs without calling it a mandate. And that's one of the things the news sources that do talk about this get a hang up on, is that there's no EV mandate because the executive orders, or specifically the orders from the Transportation Secretary, do call out the EV mandate, except that California has one. So what they've done is set regulations so high, the only way to achieve it is to sell a large mix of electric vehicles. It's a mandate without being a mandate. And that's been really the burr under the saddle here for conservatives, and specifically for Trump and now his administration. But what I find most interesting about this is that almost nobody was talking about it. The fact that this came about. So Sean Duffy is the new Transportation Secretary. And when he was sworn in, literally within hours, he was signing orders from his office, one of which is the rollback of the CAFE standards. Now, it's littered with a bunch of political speak. Let me pull up some of it here. Now, Trump had signed Executive Order 14154, Unleashing American Energy, intended to identify all existing regulatory requirements that unduly burden the development or use of domestic energy resources. Also, there's a bunch of other orders that came out from here about uprooting DEI and woke policies and things like that. But this one specifically says, quote, the fuel economy standards are set at such aggressive levels that automakers cannot, as a practical matter, satisfy the standards without rapidly shifting production away from internal combustion engines. And that is going to put a burden on the manufacturers. Now, there is an argument that changing regulatory goals every 4 years also has an effect, but the point here is that they make, and it's interesting, is that by increasing the costs, you're going to force people into older cars, which are less safe, which will increase cost and impact safety on the highways, especially. They go on to say that coercive pressure on automakers to phase out production of various models of popular internal combustion engine vehicles and re-engineer their fleet in a way that reduces dramatically the power and durability of the ICE models that they are able to offer. But all of this starts to run afoul of the Chevron doctrine. Now, I've done a whole video about that and the fact it was thrown out by the Supreme Court, and what does that really mean for the auto industry? The Chevron doctrine allowed regulators to constantly increase their regulations, but during the about 40 years it existed, one of the aspects that came out from the Supreme Court is that regulators had to take into account the financial impact of any of their regulations. And so part of that 87FR or something or another, the Federal Register, they actually talk about the cost benefit of the new fuel economy regulations. And it's interesting because nobody's ever brought this up. They actually say that the new regulations will add to the price of a car about $1,000, a little bit more than that, which is criminal when you've got a car that costs $50,000 on average now. But using my rule of thumb, that's going to add about $20 per month to your payment over a 5-year purchase, not a lease. But they say it'll save over $1,300 for the life of the car in fuel economy standards and saving it in gas. Well, what's the average life of a new vehicle? Well, it depends. Typically, it's about 12 years, but let's say it's 10 years for simplicity. $1,300 divided by 10 is $130 a year. Divided by 12 means you're saving about $11 a month. So congratulations. The new fuel economy standards will cost you $20 a month if you finance and save you $11. Somebody needs to start bringing up that level of concern for the consumer and what regulations actually mean to our pocketbook. Like I said before, liars figure. And so what this order from Sean Duffy actually says is he directs the NHTSA to commence an immediate review and reconsideration of all existing fuel economy standards applicable to models of motor vehicles produced from model year 2022 forward. And so this is not a one-size-fits-all waiver getting rid of the fuel economy standards or dictating something else. It is initiating a review. And that's important because of that law that says it has to be the highest feasible. Well, there's an argument here that it isn't feasible. And so what they're going to do is they're going to initiate this review, but it may have to go through a whole nother process, which may take another 2 years to roll them back and then kind of lock them in place. So it's the opening salvo in what I believe is going to be a loosening of U.S. fuel economy standards. And at some point, it may involve Congress. And, well, not to make this political, but I kind of support that. I think that the standards have gotten to the point where they are trying to force EVs without saying they're forcing EVs, which brings up California. Now, back in the 70s and 60s and 50s and 40s, California had horrible air quality. They actually started the air quality movement, thanks to Ronald Reagan, and they have a waiver that allows them to set separate and higher standards than what the EPA, for example, would set. That's always rubbed me wrong a little bit, but if you believe in states' rights, you should believe in the right of a state and its elected officials, based on its electorate's wants, to set higher standards. It's a burden on industry, but it's worked out okay, and California is one of the largest economies in the world by itself. They've been able to pull it off. Now, they've been ridiculous over the decades. They wanted to mandate EVs 30 years ago, something like that. You know, they've banned gas-powered lawnmowers and leaf blowers and things like that. It's not a place I want to live and put up with. But the hang-up is it's not just California anymore. I believe there's 14 states, I'll have to verify that have tied their regulations to California's. And I think the hang up is going to be, and the attack on that is going to be, California saying they want to set their own. That's one thing, but it's hurting American industry. And other states have given up their sovereignty to the electorate of California. For example, in California, the way their geography works, it tends to trap those gases in and around, say, the LA basin, and you ended up with a lot of smog. They set standards, but then over here you've got Virginia. They say, well, we're just going to meet California's standards. That means the electorate in another state has no say in what's going on within their state. It's just tied to California's. I believe there's going to be a major challenge to that based on constitutional and representational grounds. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not going to make that forecast, but I believe that's coming. And the Trump administration has already fired the first shots to break down California's waiver to set their own rules, because one of those rules has been to ban non-electrified, not mandate pure EVs, but to ban non-electrified vehicles by, I believe it's 2035. So all of this is the first opening salvos in what's going on here. And it leaves the industry in a situation where they've got rules that maybe they're onerous, maybe they're not, but it might be 2 years before the rules change, which will be 2 years before another administration, theoretically. But what's really fascinated me about all this is how little it's been picked up in the news. Now, for me personally, I read about automotive news every single day, and I read multiple news sources every single day. The way I found out about this was about 2 days ago on YouTube. Now, I have seen a couple of videos pop up on my feed that say the CAFE standards are being rolled back. And I thought they were junk AI-generated videos. The same one that say, oh, Toyota's coming back with the Celica, and it's actually just a picture of the old Celica, gussied up to act like it's something new with a AI voiceover. That's what I thought this was. Until this weekend, when one of the channels I actually respect, a automotive news channel, brought it up and started talking about it. And that's when I had to go do some research. And what was amazing is that when I did a research for Sean Duffy, the Transportation Secretary, rollback CAFE standard, something like that, most of the websites that returned were junk websites. Now, you did find Reuters, you did find the AP, and you did find the New York Times had articles on it. But they were pretty far down relatively. They were almost below the fold on a Google search. And so it's interesting that I did find a couple of articles from these places, but the rest of them were just not your big news sources. In fact, I went to CNN and ABC, and CNN, you type in Sean Duffy and it gives you stuff about Patrick Mahomes. ABC didn't have anything on it. MSNBC, which you think would use this for hay, that this is a more progressive point of view, and the Trump administration, who's evil, of course, is tearing it down. You thought this would get a lot of news. No. You can go to MSNBC, do a search for Sean Duffy, and see the gap when this occurred, and there's absolutely no news about it at all. Now, going over to Car and Driver, there's no news about it, and going over to, I think, The Drive, there was no news about it at all. Maybe they don't want to wade into the politics of it. I believe it was Autoblog actually did have a little article about it, and Automotive News did touch on it, but it hasn't been made into the issue I thought it was going to be. Now, possibly that's just because this is the first salvo, and there's 65 executive orders, the last I read, that have come out from the Trump administration. So maybe they're just buried underneath all of this news. But I'm surprised it's not getting more, because it's such a major, major industry. Now, to the industry's credit, the big guys, General Motors, Ford, Toyota, they have not said anything about this the last that I've looked up before recording this. They're all just kind of quiet about what's actually going on. And of course, there is the ongoing move from the administration to remove the rebates for EVs and things like that, which is going to hurt all those businesses who have started moving their batteries here, because they're also part of that. Part of that act gives them financial benefits for coming here. So it's really upending everything. And I'm just surprised how the big mainstream news is being completely silent about it. So the end result for you and me is that right now, nothing's changing. They're going to initiate a review. At some point, some words will come out about it. If they try to change it unilaterally, I expect lawsuits that will prevent it. Maybe it goes back to Congress, or it starts another 2-year process to have to go back and redo the process to set the standards all over again. So it's a big move that really doesn't affect anything, at least in the near term. But for somebody who thinks that it is too much regulation and that increases to nearly 60 miles per gallon by like 2031 or something like that is outrageous, at least for cars, I do believe this may be the start of a major restructuring of the EPA setting standards and the NHTSA setting the CAFE standards that maybe add a little bit more clarity and common sense to the whole thing. Let me know your thoughts below, everybody. I appreciate you being here and spending a few minutes with me.